The carriage wheel cracked against a stone, and Eliza Hartwell was thrown forward so hard her palm slammed into the doorframe. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills of Crowmoor, and the driver shouted something she could not hear over the wind. She had barely a moment to catch her breath before the carriage lurched again, tilting dangerously to one side. "Hold on, my lady," the driver called back. "The road is falling apart under us." She gripped the seat with both hands as the carriage groaned, and finally steadied. Rain hammered the roof. Through the fogged window, she caught her first glimpse of Crowmoor Castle, rising out of the mist, like a dark warning, its towers cutting into a sky the color of a bruise. She had left her father's house only 2 days ago, with a single letter in her hand, and now here she was, arriving at the home of a man she had never met, in a storm that seemed to be trying to turn her back. The letter had come without warning. Her father, Edmund Hartwell, had summoned her to his study one evening and told her, in a voice that allowed no argument, that her marriage had already been arranged. The Duke of Crowmoor needed a wife. Her father needed the alliance. And Eliza, whether she liked it or not, was the answer to both problems. She had wanted to refuse. She had opened her mouth to refuse. But her father's debts were no secret, and the Duke's name carried enough weight to erase them in a single signature. So she had swallowed her protest, packed a single trunk, and let herself be sent north, like a parcel delivered to settle an account. The carriage rattled through the iron gates of Crowmoor, and the castle swallowed the light entirely. Eliza stepped out into the rain, her boots sinking into wet gravel, and looked up at the towering front doors. They opened before she reached them, revealing a narrow woman, with silver hair pulled into a tight knot, and eyes that studied Eliza the way one might study an unfamiliar animal that had wandered onto the property. "You must be Lady Hartwell," the woman said. "I am Mrs. Whitmore, housekeeper of Crowmoor. His Grace is waiting." There was no warmth in the greeting, only duty. Eliza followed her inside, water dripping from the hem of her cloak onto the stone floor, and felt the eyes of unseen servants tracking her from doorways and shadowed corridors. The castle smelled of old wood and cold ash, as though no fire had properly warmed it in years. They walked past portrait after portrait, each face pale and unfamiliar, until they reached a set of tall doors at the end of a long hall. Mrs. Whitmore knocked once, then pushed the door open without waiting for a response. "Lady Hartwell has arrived, Your Grace." The room beyond was dim, lit only by a low fire and a single lamp on a wide desk. A man stood at the window with his back to them, tall and still, his dark coat unbuttoned, one hand resting against the stone frame, as if he were holding the wall up rather than the other way around. He did not turn immediately. "Leave us, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. The housekeeper dipped her head and withdrew, closing the door with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. Eliza stood in the center of the room, rainwater still clinging to her cloak, and waited. When the man finally turned, she saw a face carved from sharp lines and guarded eyes, a face that looked as though it had not smiled in a very long time. He was younger than she had expected, though something in the way he carried himself made him seem far older than his years. "You are Lady Eliza Hartwell," he said. It was not a question. "I am." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "And you are the Duke of Crowmoor." Alistair Vane. He said his own name, the way one might state a fact about the weather, flat and without feeling. "Your father wrote to me 3 weeks ago. I know what the letter said." Eliza lifted her chin, refusing to let the tremor in her hands reach her voice. "My father said you needed a wife." She had meant to say more. She had rehearsed, on the long ride north, exactly how she would explain herself, how she would ask questions, how she would demand to know what kind of arrangement this truly was. But standing in front of him, with the fire casting long shadows across his face, all of it fell away, and only the truth remained. The Duke studied her for a long moment. Rain struck the windows behind him in steady waves, and somewhere deeper in the castle a door slammed shut, carried by the wind. He did not blink. He did not look away. "He was right," he said finally. The words landed strangely in the quiet room, simple and unadorned, and yet they seemed to carry more weight than a full explanation would have. Eliza had expected argument, negotiation, perhaps even refusal. She had not expected agreement delivered so plainly, as though he had already made peace with a decision that had cost him nothing to make and everything to accept. "You agree, then," she said carefully, "to the marriage." "I agreed 3 weeks ago, when I signed the papers your father sent." He walked toward the desk, his boots silent on the thick carpet. "The ceremony will take place within the month. You will have the west drawing room for your own use, and Mrs. Whitmore will see that your belongings are settled in the blue chamber." "That is all?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. "You simply tell me where my belongings will be placed, as though I were a piece of furniture being moved into the house?" Something flickered across his face, there, and gone so quickly, she almost doubted she had seen it. "What would you have me say, Lady Hartwell? That I am overjoyed? That I have longed for a wife these past years, and prayed one would arrive on my doorstep in the middle of a storm?" "I would have you say something true," she said. "Anything true would do." He was quiet for a moment, and the fire popped and hissed in the silence. "The truth," he said at last, "is that I did not want a wife. I did not ask for one. But your father was persistent, and I have learned that some battles are not worth fighting, so yes. He said I needed a wife, and he was right, whether I wished it or not. It was not romantic, it was not even kind, but there was an honesty in it that Eliza had not expected, and despite herself, she found she respected it more than she would have respected empty comfort. "Then we understand each other," she said. "We understand the arrangement," he corrected. "Whether we understand each other remains to be seen." He crossed to the door and opened it, and Mrs. Whitmore appeared, as though she had been waiting just beyond it the entire time. "Show Lady Hartwell to the blue chamber," he said. "See that a fire is lit. She has traveled far in poor weather." It was the closest thing to kindness he had offered since she had entered the room, and Eliza found herself studying his face for some further sign of it as she was led away. But he had already turned back to the window, his silhouette outlined by the storm outside, and she understood that the conversation, brief as it had been, was over. The blue chamber was cold when she arrived, the fire not yet lit, the bed narrow and neatly made. Mrs. Whitmore busied herself with the hearth, while a young maid carried in Eliza's single trunk, setting it down with a soft grunt of effort. "You'll want dry clothes," Mrs. Whitmore said without looking up from the fire she was coaxing to life. "The roads north are cruel this time of year." "Thank you," Eliza said, and then, because the silence in the room pressed on her more than she liked, she added, "Has the Duke always been so direct?" Mrs. Whitmore's hands stilled for the briefest moment before continuing their work. "His Grace has had reasons to guard his words, my lady. This house has seen its share of sorrow." "What sorrow?" The housekeeper straightened, and for a moment her expression softened into something almost sympathetic. "That is not mine to tell. In time, if you stay long enough, you may learn it yourself. For now, rest. Tomorrow will bring enough to occupy you." She left with the young maid trailing behind her, and Eliza was alone in the unfamiliar room, the fire finally catching and casting flickering light across the stone walls. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pulled her damp cloak from her shoulders, listening to the storm rage outside the window. She thought of her father's face when he had told her of the arrangement, the relief in his eyes that had nothing to do with her happiness, and everything to do with his own debts finally being settled. She thought of the Duke's flat, honest words. He was right. Not "I am glad," not "I welcome you." Simply, plainly, an admission that a truth she had spoken aloud happened to match a truth he already carried. It was not the beginning she had imagined for her life. But then, she thought, watching the fire dance against the stone, she had never truly imagined what her life would look like at all. Her father had always decided that for her, and now, it seemed, so would her husband. She rose and moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. Below, the castle grounds stretched into darkness, gardens gone wild with neglect, a low stone wall marking the edge of the property where the moor began. Somewhere out there, thunder rolled again, and lightning briefly illuminated the shape of a small building at the edge of the grounds, its windows dark, its door chained shut. She did not know why the sight of it made her chest tighten, why some instinct told her that building held something she was not meant to see. But she filed the thought away, too tired from the journey to examine it further, and let the curtain fall back into place. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would begin to understand the house she had been sent to, and the man she had been sent to marry, and whatever sorrow Mrs. Whitmore had been too careful to name. Tonight, she would simply survive the storm, both the one outside her window and the one that had begun the moment she stepped out of the carriage and heard a stranger tell her that her father had been right. She lay down without changing from her traveling dress, too exhausted to manage the buttons alone, and listened to the wind howl against the ancient stones of Crowmoor. Somewhere in the castle, a door opened and closed. Footsteps passed her chamber and did not stop. And beneath it all, faint and almost imagined, she thought she heard the sound of someone weeping, though she could not have said from which direction it came, or whether it was real at all. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, unaware that the man she had married on paper, but not yet in truth, stood at his own window at that very moment, watching the same storm, thinking of the same locked building at the edge of the grounds, and wondering, not for the first time, whether he had made a terrible mistake in agreeing so quickly to a stranger's arrival. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the first of many truths Crowmoor Castle had been waiting a long time to reveal. Morning at Crowmoor arrived gray and reluctant, the storm reduced to a thin drizzle that clung to the windows like a second skin. Eliza woke stiff and cold, still in her traveling dress, and for a moment she did not know where she was. Then the stone walls, the narrow bed, the smell of damp wood, came rushing back, and she remembered exactly where her father's decision had placed her. A soft knock came at the door, before she had even risen fully. A young maid entered, no older than 16, carrying a tray with tea and a small basin of warm water. She kept her eyes down as she set the tray on the table near the window. "Good morning, my lady," the girl said quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore sent me. I'm Nan." "Thank you, Nan." Eliza sat up, rubbing the ache from her neck. "Is it always this quiet here in the mornings?" Nan hesitated, glancing toward the door, as though checking that no one else stood behind it. "Crowmoor is quiet most times, my lady. Has been for some years now." "Since what happened?" The question came out before Eliza could stop it, curiosity getting the better of manners. Nan's hands stilled on the edge of the tray, and something like fear crossed her young face. "I couldn't say, my lady. It isn't my place." She bobbed a quick curtsy. "Mrs. Whitmore will be along shortly to see you settled. Breakfast is served in the East Room, when you're ready." She left quickly, almost too quickly, and Eliza was left staring at the closed door, turning the girl's nervousness over in her mind. Everyone in this house seemed to speak in half-sentences, as though a full explanation might bring down the roof. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple gray gown, suited to the somber mood of the castle, and made her way down the winding staircase toward the East Room. The castle looked different in daylight, though no less imposing. Tapestries lined the corridors, their colors faded with age. Portraits watched her pass, generations of veins staring down with painted eyes, though she noticed something odd as she walked. Several frames along one wall stood empty, pale rectangles marking where paintings had once hung and had since been removed. She paused in front of one such gap, running her fingers lightly over the faded wallpaper behind it. That was the portrait of the late Duchess. Eliza turned to find Mrs. Whitmore standing a few paces behind her, hands folded neatly at her waist, her expression unreadable. "The Duke's mother?" Eliza asked. "His wife," Mrs. Whitmore corrected. "His first wife, she passed some years ago. His Grace had the portraits removed not long after." Eliza's breath caught slightly. No one had mentioned a first wife, not in her father's letters, not in the brief conversation she'd had with the Duke the night before. "I did not know he had been married before. It is not a subject the household discusses freely, my lady. I would advise you do the same, at least until His Grace chooses to speak of it himself." Mrs. Whitmore's tone was not unkind, but it left no room for further questions. "Breakfast is waiting. You mustn't let it go cold." The East Room was warmer than the rest of the castle, sunlight struggling through tall windows to spill weakly across a long table set for two. Only one place, however, showed signs of use, a half-finished cup of tea and a folded newspaper resting beside an empty chair. The Duke, it seemed, had already eaten and gone. Eliza sat alone, picking at her food without much appetite, her mind circling the gaps on the walls, the nervous maid, the housekeeper's careful silence. A first wife. No one had told her. Her father, in his eagerness to settle his debts, had either not known or had chosen not to mention it, and Eliza suspected the latter was more likely. She spent the morning exploring what parts of the castle seemed open to her, careful not to wander anywhere that might be considered forbidden. The library was vast and dusty, shelves climbing to the ceiling, though half the books looked untouched in years. A music room sat silent, its piano lid closed and locked. A long gallery displayed weapons and shields from centuries past, polished but clearly unused. It was in the gallery that she encountered the Duke again, standing before a suit of armor with his hands clasped behind his back, seemingly lost in thought. He did not hear her approach at first, and she took a moment to study him before announcing herself. In the daylight, the shadows under his eyes were more visible, and the tension in his shoulders seemed permanent, as though he had forgotten how to stand any other way. "Your Grace," she said finally. He turned, and the guarded expression returned to his face almost instantly, as though a door had been shut. "Lady Hartwell, I trust you slept well, given the circumstances of your arrival." "Well enough." She glanced at the armor beside him. "This castle holds a great deal of history, more than most would wish to carry," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. "You have questions. I can see them in your face." She considered lying, considered pretending she had none, but something about his directness the night before had told her that pretense would not serve her well in this house. "I learned this morning that you were married before." His jaw tightened, just slightly, but he did not look away. "Yes. No one told me." "Would it have changed your father's decision to send you here?" His tone was not cruel, merely factual, but the words stung regardless. "Perhaps not," Eliza admitted, "but it might have changed how I understood what I was walking into." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting to the suit of armor beside him, as though the metal held some answer he could not find elsewhere. "Her name was Cassandra," he said finally, so quietly Eliza almost missed it. "She died 4 years ago. That is all I intend to say on the matter, today or any other day, unless I choose otherwise." "I understand," Eliza said, though she did not fully. But she recognized the wall he had built around the subject, and she knew better than to attempt to climb it so soon. "Do you?" He studied her, something searching in his gaze. "Most people in your position would press further. Curiosity is not easily satisfied by silence." "I am not most people," she said simply, "and I imagine grief does not answer well to prying." Something shifted in his expression then, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even the beginning of respect. "No," he agreed. "It does not." They stood together in silence for a moment, the weight of the unspoken, settling comfortably enough between them that Eliza did not feel compelled to fill it with more words. Finally, the Duke gestured toward the gallery's far end. "There is a walking path through the eastern gardens, if the weather permits. Mrs. Whitmore can show you, should you wish for fresh air later. The castle can feel confining to those unused to it." It was, she realized, an offer, awkward and stiff, but an offer nonetheless. "Thank you. I may take you up on that." He nodded once and turned to leave, but paused at the gallery's entrance, his back still to her. "Lady Hartwell." "Yes?" "The rules of this house are not meant to make you a prisoner. They exist because some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. I would ask that you respect them, for both our sakes." Before she could ask which doors he meant, he had gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving her alone in the gallery, with the silent armor and the unanswered questions pressing heavier than before. That afternoon, true to his word, she found Mrs. Whitmore willing to walk her through the eastern gardens, though wild and overgrown, roses climbing untamed over broken trellises, hedges grown shapeless with neglect. It must once have been beautiful, Eliza thought, before whatever grief had swept through Crowmoor left it, like so much else in the castle, abandoned mid-bloom. As they walked, she caught sight again of the small stone building at the edge of the grounds, the one she had glimpsed through her window during the storm. Closer now, she could see its door was indeed chained, rust creeping along the iron links, ivy climbing the walls, as though trying to swallow the structure whole. "What is that building?" she asked, unable to help herself. Mrs. Whitmore's steps slowed, her expression tightening. "That is the old West Wing, my lady." separate from the main house. It has been closed for some years. Closed why? That, Mrs. Whitmore said, resuming her pace with renewed briskness, is a question best left for His Grace, should he ever choose to answer it. Come. The wind grows sharp. We should return before the rain finds us again. Eliza allowed herself to be led back toward the castle, though she cast one final glance over her shoulder at the chained door and the ivy-choked walls. Whatever secret Crowmoor was keeping, it lived behind that door, and she found herself certain, with a conviction she could not quite explain, that she would not rest easy until she understood what it was. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair, the Duke present but distant, speaking only when necessary, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the window, as though watching for something in the darkening gardens. Eliza studied him across the long table, searching for some crack in the composure he wore like armor, and found only glimpses, brief and fleeting, of something far more fragile underneath. As the meal ended, and she prepared to retire, he spoke again, his voice low. "Lady Hartwell." "Yes?" "Whatever you may hear about this house, about its history, about me, I would ask you to reserve judgment until you have heard it from someone who knows the truth of it." "And who would that be?" she asked. "You said this morning you did not intend to speak of it." "No," he agreed, his gaze steady on hers. "But I did not say I never would." It was not an answer, not truly, but it was more than she had expected, and she found herself carrying his words up the winding staircase to her chamber that night, turning them over like a puzzle, whose final piece remained just out of reach. Somewhere in this castle, behind locked doors and careful silences, lay the truth of what had happened to the woman named Cassandra, and Eliza understood, with growing certainty, that finding it would not be simple, and might not be safe. But she had never been one to leave a door unopened, simply because she had been told not to knock. And Crowmoor, it seemed, held more doors than any house she had ever known. 3 days passed before Eliza worked up the courage to approach the chained door of the west wing on her own. She told herself it was simple curiosity, nothing more, but she knew, deep down, that it was something closer to necessity. She could not share a home, let alone a marriage, with a man whose past remained a locked room she was forbidden to enter. She waited until the household had settled into its afternoon routines, Mrs. Whitmore occupied with the linens, the Duke away in the eastern fields inspecting tenant repairs after the storm. Nan had mentioned, in a rare unguarded moment over morning tea, that the Duke rarely returned from such inspections before evening. Eliza slipped out through a side door and crossed the overgrown gardens quickly, her cloak pulled tight against the wind. The stone building looked smaller up close than it had from her window, though no less foreboding, ivy crawling thick over its walls, the single door bound with a heavy chain, and a rusted padlock that had clearly not been opened in years. She tested the chain anyway, tugging at it uselessly, and circled the building looking for another way in. A single window, high and narrow, had been left uncovered, though grime coated the glass so thickly she could see nothing through it. She stood on her toes, straining to peer inside, and caught only vague shapes in the darkness beyond, indistinct shadows that might have been furniture, or might have been nothing at all. "I told you, these doors were not meant to be opened." She spun around, heart lurching, to find the Duke standing a few paces away, his coat still dusted with the mud of the eastern fields, his expression harder than she had yet seen it. He must have returned early, and something in his stride as he crossed the garden told her he had come looking for her the moment he'd learned she was not in the house. "I was only curious," she said, though the excuse sounded thin even to her own ears. "Curiosity is a luxury this house cannot always afford." His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge beneath it that had not been there in their previous conversations. "I asked you to respect the rules of this house. Was I not clear?" "You were clear," Eliza said, refusing to lower her eyes, despite the anger radiating from him. "But you gave me no reason to respect a rule I do not understand. You cannot expect blind obedience from a stranger you brought into your home on a piece of paper." For a moment, he said nothing, his jaw working as though caught between fury and something else entirely. Then, unexpectedly, the tension in his shoulders seemed to crack, just slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its hard edge. "You are right," he admitted quietly. "I have asked you to trust rules without offering trust in return." That is not fair to you. Eliza blinked, surprised by the sudden shift. Then tell me, what is behind that door? He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the ivy-choked walls, his expression unreadable in the fading afternoon light. When he finally spoke, his voice had grown distant, as though he were speaking from somewhere far away. That building was meant to be a nursery, he said. Cassandra and I had it built the year we married, before either of us knew whether we would need it. She wanted it separate from the main house, quiet, filled with morning light. She spent months choosing the colors, the furniture, everything down to the smallest detail. Eliza's breath caught, understanding beginning to dawn even before he continued. We lost the child before it was ever born, he said, his voice steady but strained, as though each word cost him something. And not long after, Cassandra fell ill. She never recovered. The room was never used for what it was meant for. I could not bring myself to open it again, not to clear it out, not to repurpose it, not even to look inside. So I had it locked, and I have not set foot near it since. The wind stirred the ivy against the stone walls, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eliza felt something shift inside her chest, the careful anger she had carried into the confrontation, dissolving into something closer to sorrow. I am sorry, she said quietly. I did not know. No one does, beyond this household, he said, and I would ask that it remain that way, not out of shame, but because grief, once spoken aloud too often, begins to feel like performance rather than truth. I understand, Eliza said, and this time, she meant it fully. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, a wariness giving way, slowly, to something gentler. You asked for a reason to respect the rules of this house. I have given you one. I hope it is enough. It is more than enough, she said. Thank you for trusting me with it. He nodded once, then gestured toward the main house. Come. The wind grows cold, and Mrs. Whitmore will worry if we are both absent come tea time. They walked back together in silence, though it was a different silence than before, less guarded, threaded with something that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of understanding between two people who had been strangers only days ago. Eliza glanced sideways at him as they walked, studying the tight set of his jaw, the careful way he held himself, as though grief were something he carried physically, a weight balanced precisely so it would not topple him entirely. That evening, dinner passed with fewer silences than before. The Duke spoke of the tenant farms he had inspected, of repairs needed before winter set in fully, and Eliza found herself listening with genuine interest, asking questions that drew longer answers than she had expected. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was no longer the cold distance of their first meeting either. You handle the estate yourself? She asked, as the last course was cleared away. I would have thought a man of your position would leave such matters to stewards. I did, once, he said. But stewards make decisions based on ledgers, not on the people those decisions affect. I prefer to see the farms myself, to know the families who depend on this land. That is not what I expected to hear from the Duke of Crowmoor, Eliza admitted. A ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face. What did you expect, Lady Hartwell? Someone colder, someone who saw his tenants as numbers on a page, and his wife as another line in a ledger to be balanced. Perhaps I was that man, once. His voice grew quieter. Before Cassandra. Grief has a way of rearranging what a man believes matters. Eliza considered this, turning her wine glass slowly between her fingers. And what do you believe matters now? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes meeting hers across the table, with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. I am still learning the answer to that question, he said finally. Perhaps you might help me find it. It was not a declaration, not yet, but it was an opening, however small, and Eliza felt something warm stir in her chest, despite the strangeness of the circumstances that had brought them together. She had come to Crowmoor expecting a cold arrangement, a marriage built on debts and obligations. She had not expected to find a man capable of such quiet honesty, nor had she expected to feel, so soon, a genuine desire to understand him fully. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Nan arrived with fresh linens, her manner considerably more relaxed than it had been on Eliza's first morning at Crowmoor. You spoke with His Grace today, the girl said, folding the linens carefully. About the West Wing. Eliza glanced up, surprised. How did you know? Mrs. Whitmore mentioned it, Nan admitted. She said you were the first person he's spoken to about it since the funeral. Not even his sister has heard the full truth of it. Not from his own lips. His sister? Eliza had not heard mention of a sister before. Lady Margaret, Nan said. She lives some distance from here, in the south. She and His Grace do not speak often. There was some falling out after the late Duchess passed. I don't know the full story, my lady, only that it grieves the household to see them so distant, brother and sister as they are. Eliza filed this information away carefully, another thread in the tapestry of Crowmoor's quiet sorrows. A sister estranged, a wife lost, a nursery locked away behind ivy and rust. The Duke carried more grief than she had first understood, layered and complicated, and she found herself wondering, as Nan finished her work and bid her good night, whether healing this house might require more than simple kindness. It might require patience. It might require time. And increasingly, though she could not yet name the feeling fully, she found she was willing to offer both. She fell asleep that night, without the storm of her first evening, the castle quiet around her, and dreamed, for reasons she could not explain upon waking, of a garden in full bloom, and a nursery filled with morning light. A week after their conversation by the West Wing, life at Crowmoor had begun to settle into something resembling routine, though never quite comfort. Eliza rose each morning to find Nan waiting with tea, walked the gardens when weather allowed, and spent her afternoons slowly working her way through the neglected library, cataloging books that had not been touched in years. The Duke, for his part, seemed to seek her company more deliberately than before, joining her for tea in the East Room, offering small observations about the estate, the tenants, the changing weather. It was during one such afternoon, as autumn light slanted through the tall library windows, that a letter arrived, bearing a wax seal Eliza did not recognize. Mrs. Whitmore delivered it to the Duke personally, her expression carefully neutral, though something in the set of her shoulders suggested she already knew its contents would not please him. The Duke read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening with each line, until finally he set it down on the table with more force than necessary. Trouble? Eliza asked carefully. An old acquaintance, he said, his voice clipped. Lady Constance Ashworth has written to inform me she will be visiting the county next week, and intends to call on Crowmoor, as courtesy demands of neighbors. You do not sound pleased by the prospect. Lady Constance was a great friend of Cassandra's, he said, choosing his words with obvious care. And, before my marriage, she had hoped to become something more to me than a friend. She did not take kindly to being passed over. Eliza felt something tighten in her chest, an unfamiliar and unwelcome sensation she recognized, with some discomfort, as jealousy. I see. There is nothing to see, the Duke said quickly, perhaps sensing the shift in her demeanor. It was years ago, before Cassandra, and nothing came of it, beyond disappointed expectations on her part. But Constance has never been one to let a grudge fade quietly. Then perhaps her visit will be brief, Eliza said, though she did not fully believe it. I would not count on that, he said grimly, folding the letter and setting it aside. Constance has a talent for making brief visits stretch into extended stays, and an even greater talent for stirring trouble wherever she settles. True to the Duke's prediction, Lady Constance Ashworth arrived not the following week as promised, but 3 days early, her carriage rolling up the drive unannounced on a crisp autumn morning, while Eliza was still walking the gardens with Nan. Word spread through the household quickly, and by the time Eliza returned to the main hall, Constance had already installed herself in the drawing room, demanding tea and complaining, loudly, about the state of the roads. She was, Eliza noted upon entering, strikingly beautiful, with golden hair arranged in elaborate curls, and a gown clearly tailored for a grander occasion than a country visit. Her eyes, however, held a calculating sharpness that made Eliza's instincts prickle with wariness, even before a single word passed between them. You must be the new Duchess, Constance said, rising with theatrical grace as Eliza entered. Alistair mentioned he had married, though he was rather sparse with details. I had to hear the rest from common gossip, which I confess left me quite curious to see you for myself. Lady Ashworth, Eliza said, offering a polite curtsy, despite the unease coiling in her stomach. I hope your journey was not too difficult. Difficult enough, Constance said, settling back into her chair with a dramatic sigh. But worth it, I think, now that I see the woman who has taken Cassandra's place. The comment landed with deliberate precision, and Eliza felt her spine stiffen. I have not taken anyone's place, Lady Ashworth. I am simply the Duke's wife. Of course, Constance said, though her smile suggested she did not believe a word of it. Forgive me. It is only strange, seeing someone new in this house, after everything that happened here. Cassandra and I were the closest of friends, you understand. I knew this house, and this family, long before you arrived. I am sure your friendship was a great comfort to her, Eliza said carefully, refusing to be baited into open conflict so soon. It was, Constance agreed, which is precisely why I feel it my duty to look after Alistair, even now. Grief changes a man, Duchess. Sometimes it makes him vulnerable to decisions he might not otherwise make, decisions driven by loneliness rather than true feeling. The implication was clear enough, and Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced herself to remain composed. Are you suggesting my marriage was a mistake, Lady Ashworth? I am suggesting nothing, Constance said sweetly. I am merely an old friend, concerned for a man who has suffered more than most. You must forgive my caution. I have seen what happens when this house makes hasty decisions. Before Eliza could respond, the Duke entered the room, his expression tightening the moment he saw Constance seated comfortably in his drawing room. Constance, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I did not expect you so soon. I could not wait, Alistair, Constance said, rising to greet him with a familiarity that made Eliza's jaw clench. I had to see for myself how you were faring, and to meet your new wife. As you can see, I am faring well, he said, though his tone carried an edge Eliza had not heard, directed at Constance before. And Eliza has settled into Crowmoor admirably. Eliza, Constance repeated, testing the name as though it were an unfamiliar dish. How lovely. Well, I do hope she understands the weight of the position she has taken on. This house does not easily forget its history, does it, Alistair? The Duke's expression darkened, something protective flaring behind his eyes. Crowmoor's history is not a subject for idle conversation, Constance. I would ask you to remember that. Of course, Constance said, though her smile suggested she had accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. I only meant to welcome the Duchess properly. Nothing more. The tension in the room remained long after Constance had been shown to her guest chambers, and Eliza found herself standing alone with the Duke in the drawing room, the fire crackling softly between them. I am sorry, he said quietly. I did not expect her to arrive so soon, nor to speak so freely. She does not think much of me, Eliza said, keeping her voice steady, despite the churn of emotion beneath it. She does not think much of anyone who is not herself, the Duke said, a note of weary frustration in his voice. Do not let her words settle too deeply. Constance has always had a talent for finding weak places and pressing on them, whether they truly exist or not. And do they exist? Eliza asked, unable to stop herself. Weak places in our marriage, I mean. The Duke turned to face her fully, his expression softening into something she had not seen from him before, something almost tender. If they do, he said quietly, I have not found them yet, and I do not intend to let Constance manufacture cracks where none exist. It was, perhaps, the most reassuring thing he had said to her since her arrival, and Eliza held onto the words carefully as she retired that evening, aware that Constance's visit, however brief the Duke hoped it might be, had already begun to test the fragile trust they had built between them. She lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind press against the old stone walls, and wondered how many more tests Crowmoor intended to place before her, and whether she would prove equal to them all. Constance Ashworth did not leave within days as the Duke had hoped. Instead, she extended her stay under the pretense of poor weather making travel unwise, and settled into Crowmoor with the ease of someone who considered the house partly her own domain. Eliza found herself navigating the strange tension of hosting a guest who seemed determined to undermine her at every opportunity, while maintaining the appearance of perfect civility in front of the Duke. It was during a walk through the Eastern Gardens, 3 days into Constance's extended visit, that the other woman finally dropped all pretense of friendliness. Eliza had gone out alone, seeking a moment of quiet, away from the watchful eyes of the household. only to find Constance already seated on a stone bench near the roses, as though she had been waiting. "You seem troubled, Duchess," Constance said, not looking up from the embroidery in her lap. "Marriage to Alistair proving more difficult than you expected?" "Marriage to anyone requires adjustment," Eliza said carefully, seating herself on the opposite end of the bench. "I imagine you know that as well as anyone." "I know a great deal about Alistair," Constance said, setting her embroidery aside with deliberate slowness. "More perhaps than you realize. Cassandra told me everything, in her final months, about the nursery, about the child they lost, about how he blamed himself for not calling the physician sooner." Eliza's breath caught. "He told me about the nursery, about the child. Did he tell you everything?" Constance's eyes gleamed with something sharp and unkind. "Did he tell you that Cassandra begged him, in her final days, to promise he would never marry again? That he made that promise, and broke it the moment your father's letter arrived offering to settle his debts?" The words struck like a physical blow, and Eliza felt her composure waver, despite her best efforts to maintain it. "That is not true, isn't it?" Constance leaned forward slightly. "Ask him yourself, Duchess, if you dare. Ask him what promise he made to his dying wife, and how quickly he abandoned it once convenience presented itself." "I do not believe you," Eliza said, though doubt had already begun to creep into her voice, despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "Belief is a luxury," Constance said, rising gracefully and smoothing her skirts. "Truth does not require your belief to remain true. I would simply advise you not to grow too attached to a man who has already broken one solemn promise. What guarantee do you have that he would not break another, made to you?" She left Eliza sitting alone among the neglected roses, the words settling like poison in her chest. Eliza told herself, repeatedly, that Constance could not be trusted, that her every word had been carefully chosen to sow doubt rather than to share truth. And yet the seed had been planted regardless, and she found it impossible to fully uproot despite her efforts. That evening, she found the Duke in his study, poring over ledgers by lamplight, and hesitated at the threshold, uncertain whether to voice the doubt Constance had planted, or to let it fade quietly, unspoken and unconfirmed. "You seem distracted," he said, glancing up before she had said a word. "I spoke with Lady Ashworth this afternoon," Eliza admitted, deciding that honesty, however uncomfortable, served them both better than silence. Something in his expression tightened immediately. "What did she say?" "She told me that Cassandra asked you to promise you would never remarry, and that you broke that promise the moment my father's letter arrived." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, setting down his pen with careful precision, as though buying himself time to choose his words. "It is true that Cassandra asked such a thing of me, near the end," he said finally. "Grief and fear make people ask many things they might not otherwise ask, and I understood, even then, that her request came from a place of pain, rather than reason." "And you agreed to it?" "I agreed to comfort a dying woman, in whatever way I could," he said, his voice low and strained. "It was not a promise I made with clear thought, Eliza. It was a promise made to ease suffering in her final hours, nothing more." "Constance seems to believe otherwise." "Constance believes whatever serves her purposes best," the Duke said, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features for the first time since Eliza had known him. "She has resented me since before Cassandra's illness, resented the marriage itself, and has spent years searching for ways to punish me for a choice made long before you ever entered this house. Why does she resent it so deeply?" He hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his hair in evident frustration. "Because Constance believed, for a time, that she and I might marry instead. Our families were close, our expectations aligned, and when I chose Cassandra instead, Constance took the rejection as a personal insult she has never fully released. And now she sees an opportunity to punish you through me," Eliza said quietly, understanding beginning to settle uncomfortably into place. "Yes," he admitted. "I am sorry, Eliza. I should have warned you more clearly of her nature before she arrived. I underestimated how far she might go to unsettle you." "She very nearly succeeded," Eliza said honestly. "But not entirely," he said, watching her carefully. "You came to me instead of simply believing her. That matters more than you may realize." Eliza considered this, the tension in her chest slowly beginning to ease. I want to trust you, she said quietly. But trust is difficult to build when there are so many rooms in this house I am not permitted to see. So many parts of your past kept just out of reach. I know, he said, and for the first time, genuine regret colored his voice. I have spent so long guarding myself against grief that I have perhaps guarded myself against you as well, without meaning to. That is not fair to either of us. Then let us begin correcting it, Eliza said. No more half-truths, no more careful silences. If Constance intends to use gaps in our understanding against us, let us close those gaps ourselves before she can. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, warmer than she had yet seen from him. Agreed, he said finally. Ask me anything, Eliza. I will answer as honestly as I am able. It was, perhaps, the truest offer he had made her since her arrival, and Eliza found herself grateful for it, despite the discomfort of the conversation that had led them there. Constance's poison, it seemed, had backfired, drawing husband and wife closer together rather than driving them apart, though Eliza suspected the woman would not give up so easily on her efforts to unsettle them. She was right to suspect it. Over the following days, Constance's comments grew sharper, her presence more constant, her small cruelties disguised increasingly thinly beneath a veneer of polite concern. She spoke often of Cassandra, always in Eliza's hearing, always framing comparisons that left Eliza feeling as though she were being measured against a memory she could never hope to match. Yet each evening, Eliza and the Duke met privately to share what had passed during the day, comparing notes on Constance's behavior, building between them a united front that the other woman's efforts could not easily penetrate. It became, in its strange way, a kind of courtship, born not of romance but of shared adversity, and Eliza found herself looking forward to those quiet evening conversations more than she cared to admit. She will not stay much longer, the Duke said one evening, as they sat together near the fire in his study, the household long since retired for the night. I intend to ask her to leave tomorrow, regardless of the weather she claims prevents her travel. She will not go quietly, Eliza warned. No, he agreed, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. But I find I no longer have patience for her games, nor any desire to let her continue testing a bond I have come to value more than I expected to. Eliza felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, unexpected and welcome. A bond you value, she repeated softly. Is that what this is becoming? I believe it might be, he said, meeting her eyes steadily. Though I confess, I am still learning what to call it. Neither of them spoke further on the matter that night, the conversation left deliberately unfinished, like a door left ajar rather than fully opened. But as Eliza climbed the stairs to her chamber, she found herself smiling for reasons that had nothing to do with the challenges Constance's presence had brought, and everything to do with the quiet promise held in the Duke's unfinished words. The Duke made good on his word the following morning, requesting a private audience with Constance in the drawing room shortly after breakfast. Eliza was not present for the conversation, though she waited nearby in the corridor, close enough to hear the rise and fall of voices without catching every word, close enough to sense the moment the exchange turned sharp. Constance emerged first, her face flushed with anger, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. She caught sight of Eliza waiting in the hallway and paused, her eyes narrowing with something close to hatred. You think you have won something, Constance said quietly, venom lacing every word. But you know nothing of this house, nothing of the man you married, nothing of what waits beneath the surface of his careful kindness. Enjoy your victory while it lasts, Duchess. I do not think it will last long. She swept past without waiting for a response, and within the hour her carriage was loaded and departing down the long drive, disappearing into the gray autumn morning. Eliza watched from an upstairs window until the carriage vanished entirely, relief and unease warring within her in equal measure. The Duke found her still standing at the window some time later, his expression tired but lighter than she had seen it in days. She is gone, he said simply. I do not expect she will return any time soon. She warned me my victory would not last, Eliza said, unable to keep the worry from her voice entirely. Constance always leaves warnings behind her, like a trail of thorns, he said, moving to stand beside her at the window. Do not let them take root. She has no power here beyond what we choose to give her. I hope you are right, Eliza said, though something in Constance's final words lingered uncomfortably. A splinter, she could not quite work free. In the weeks that followed Constance's departure, Crowmoor settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time since Eliza's arrival, almost peaceful. The Duke sought her company more openly, no longer confining their conversations to careful evening exchanges, but seeking her out during the day as well, walking with her through the gardens, discussing estate matters over breakfast, even laughing, on rare occasions, at some small observation she offered. Eliza found herself, to her own surprise, genuinely content. The castle that had seemed so cold and foreboding on her first stormy night, now felt, in the golden light of a mild autumn, like something closer to a home, its history, no longer a weight pressing down upon her, but simply a part of the man she was slowly coming to know and understand. It was during one such peaceful afternoon that a letter arrived from the Duke's estranged sister, Lady Margaret Vane, requesting permission to visit Crowmoor for the first time in nearly 4 years. The Duke read the letter with an expression Eliza had not seen from him before, something caught between hope and dread. "Margaret wishes to visit," he said, setting the letter down carefully. "She writes that she has heard of my marriage and wishes to meet my wife." "You have not spoken of her much," Eliza said carefully, sensing the tension beneath his careful words. "Nan mentioned there had been some falling out between you after Cassandra's passing. Margaret believed I withdrew too far into grief," he said quietly, staring at the letter as though it might rearrange itself into something less complicated. "She wished me to lean on family, to let her help carry the weight of what happened. I refused, again and again, until she finally stopped offering, and the distance between us became permanent rather than temporary. Do you wish to see her again?" "I do," he admitted, surprising himself as much as Eliza with the honesty of the answer. "I have wished it for some time, but pride and grief together make poor counselors, and I did not know how to reach out without admitting how much I had failed her by shutting her out." "Perhaps her visit is the opportunity you both need," Eliza suggested gently. "A chance to begin repairing what grief tore apart." The Duke considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps you are right. I will write to her today, inviting her to visit at her earliest convenience." Lady Margaret arrived 2 weeks later, and Eliza was struck immediately by the resemblance between brother and sister, the same sharp cheekbones, the same guarded eyes that softened only slowly, cautiously, as trust was earned rather than given freely. Margaret greeted Eliza with careful politeness at first, though warmth crept into her manner as the day progressed, particularly once she saw how her brother's demeanor had changed since Eliza's arrival. "You have brought light back into this house," Margaret said quietly, as she and Eliza walked together through the gardens on the second day of her visit, the Duke occupied elsewhere with estate matters. "I have not seen Alistair smile so freely in years. Not since before Cassandra fell ill. He carries a great deal of grief," Eliza said carefully. "I have only begun to understand how much." "More than most realize," Margaret agreed, her expression clouding briefly. "I tried, after her passing, to help him carry it. But he pushed everyone away, myself included, convinced that suffering alone was somehow a form of penance he owed her memory." "He mentioned as much," Eliza said, "that your distance was born of his refusal to accept help, rather than any true falling out between you." Margaret paused, studying Eliza with an expression that held both surprise and gratitude. "He told you that? He has never admitted such a thing to me directly, not even when I pressed him on it. Perhaps admitting fault to a sister feels different than admitting it to a stranger he had no history with," Eliza suggested. "I came to this house without expectations, without old wounds between us. Perhaps that made honesty easier to offer." "Then I am glad my father's letter found its way to Alistair," Margaret said, a faint smile touching her lips. "Whatever brought you here, Eliza, I believe it may prove to be exactly what this family needed." The visit continued for another week, and Eliza watched with quiet satisfaction as the distance between brother and sister slowly began to close. Old grievances aired, and, gradually, forgiven. By the time Margaret's carriage departed down the long drive, promising to return again soon, the Duke's expression carried none of the guarded weariness Eliza had grown accustomed to since her arrival. "Thank you," he said that evening, as they sat together near the fire, the castle quiet around them. for encouraging Margaret's visit, for helping mend what I did not know how to mend myself. You did the mending, Eliza said. I only opened the door. You have done more than that, he said, his voice softening in a way that made her breath catch slightly. You have opened doors throughout this entire house, Eliza. Doors I did not believe could be opened again. She met his eyes across the small distance between them, warmth spreading through her chest at the sincerity in his words. There is still one door left closed, she said quietly, thinking of the ivy-covered nursery at the edge of the grounds. Yes, he agreed, his expression growing thoughtful rather than guarded. Perhaps, in time, we might open that one as well, together rather than alone. It was not a promise, not entirely, but it was the closest thing to one he had offered since her arrival, and Eliza found herself carrying the words with her, long after she had retired for the evening, hope blooming quietly in her chest, like the first green shoots pushing through winter soil. Winter arrived at Crowmoor sooner than expected, frost silvering the gardens overnight, the air turning sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Eliza had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the castle by then, comfortable enough to consider it, for the first time, something resembling a true home. It was during this fragile peace that the first whispers reached her, carried not through any direct confrontation, but through the careful, indirect channels gossip always seemed to find. It began with a comment from a merchant's wife in the nearby village, relayed to Nan by another servant, who mentioned it to Eliza, almost as an afterthought, while mending a torn hem. Word had begun circulating, the woman said, that the late Duchess Cassandra's death had not been as simple as the household had always claimed. Some said she had not merely fallen ill. Some said the Duke's grief masked something closer to guilt. Eliza dismissed it at first as idle village talk, the kind of speculation that inevitably grew around tragedy, particularly tragedy involving the wealthy and titled. But the whispers did not fade as she expected. Instead, they grew louder, spreading from the village into the wider county, until finally, a letter arrived that could not be so easily dismissed. This one addressed directly to the Duke, from a distant cousin of Cassandra's family, demanding answers regarding rumors that had reached even that distant corner of the country. The Duke read the letter in grim silence, his face draining of color as he reached the final lines. They are asking whether Cassandra's death should be formally investigated, he said quietly, setting the letter down with hands that trembled slightly. They believe there may have been foul play involved in her passing. Eliza felt the ground shift beneath her, the peaceful rhythm of recent weeks shattering in an instant. That is absurd. You told me yourself she fell ill after losing the child. Surely there is a physician who can confirm the truth of it. Dr. Bramwell attended her throughout her final months, the Duke said, though his voice carried a tension that had not been there moments before. He can confirm the nature of her illness, certainly, but rumors do not require truth to do damage, Eliza. They require only enough uncertainty to take root. Who would spread such rumors? Eliza asked, though even as she spoke the question, she felt a cold certainty settling into place, the answer already forming before the Duke gave voice to it. Constance, he said grimly. This bears her signature as clearly as if she had written it herself. She warned you, did she not, that your victory would not last? The realization settled like a stone in Eliza's stomach. Constance had not simply retreated after her departure from Crowmoor. She had regrouped, and now, months later, had launched an attack far more dangerous than any comment made over embroidery in a quiet garden. This was not merely an attempt to unsettle Eliza's confidence. This was an attempt to destroy the Duke's reputation entirely, to cast suspicion over a tragedy that had already cost him more than most could bear. We must confront her, Eliza said, urgency rising in her chest. Before this spreads further, before it reaches ears that might act upon it without seeking the truth first. It may already be too late for that, the Duke said grimly. This letter came from Cassandra's own family. If they believe the rumors sufficiently, they may petition for a formal inquiry, regardless of what we say in our own defense. Then we must ensure the truth reaches them before the rumors do further damage, Eliza said firmly. Dr. Bramwell can testify to the true nature of her illness. Mrs. Whitmore, Nan, anyone in this household who witnessed her decline can confirm there was nothing sinister in what happened. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like gratitude mixing with the fear in his expression. You would stand beside me through this? Even knowing how it might reflect upon you, to be associated with such a scandal? I married you, Eliza said simply. For better or for worse, whatever the circumstances that brought us together, I do not intend to abandon you now, when Constance's malice threatens everything we have built. They spent the following days in urgent preparation, the Duke writing to Cassandra's family directly, laying out the timeline of her illness in careful detail, requesting that Dr. Bramwell provide written testimony to accompany his own account. Eliza rode into the village herself, speaking with those who had witnessed Cassandra's decline, gathering statements that might counter whatever poison Constance had spread through whispered conversation and carefully placed rumor. It was during one such visit to the village that Eliza encountered Constance directly, for the first time since her departure from Crowmoor months earlier. The other woman emerged from the local apothecary, just as Eliza was preparing to leave, and for a moment, the two women simply stared at each other across the narrow street, the tension between them thick enough to feel physically. "Duchess," Constance said finally, her voice carrying false pleasantness. "I did not expect to see you in the village. Trouble at Crowmoor, perhaps." "You know precisely what trouble there is," Eliza said, abandoning any pretense of civility. "You spread these rumors yourself, did you not? About Cassandra's death." Constance's expression flickered, something almost like satisfaction crossing her features before she smoothed it away. "I merely shared my observations with those who asked. If people choose to draw conclusions from those observations, that is hardly my doing." "You lied," Eliza said, her voice low and furious. "You know as well as I do that Cassandra's illness followed the loss of her child, that Dr. Bramwell attended her throughout, that there was nothing sinister in her passing." "I know what I was told," Constance said coldly. "But grief changes a man, Duchess, as I warned you before. Perhaps Alistair's guilt over failing to save the child transformed itself, in his mind, into something he could not bear to examine too closely. Perhaps his hand was not entirely absent from what followed." "That is a monstrous accusation, and you know it to be false," Eliza said, fury rising hot in her chest. "You seek only to punish him for a rejection you have never managed to release, and you are willing to destroy an innocent woman's memory and her husband's reputation to satisfy that bitterness." Constance's composure cracked slightly at the accusation, something raw and wounded flashing briefly in her eyes before the careful mask returned. "Believe what you wish, Duchess, but mark my words, this will not end quietly. Cassandra's family has influence, and they will not rest until they have answers, whether those answers prove convenient for you and your husband or not." She swept past without waiting for a response, leaving Eliza standing in the cold village street, her hands trembling with barely contained anger. Whatever peace Crowmoor had found in recent months, it seemed, was about to face its most severe test yet, and Eliza understood, with grim certainty, that the coming days would determine not only the Duke's reputation, but the very foundation of the trust they had so carefully built between them. She returned to Crowmoor that evening to find the Duke waiting anxiously in the entrance hall, his relief at her return quickly giving way to concern as he read the anger still evident on her face. "I encountered Constance in the village," she said, before he could ask. "She all but confirmed she is behind these rumors, though she stopped short of outright admission. She means to see this through, Alistair. Cassandra's family will not be easily satisfied." The Duke's expression hardened, with a resolve Eliza had not seen from him before, something steady and unyielding beneath the fear that had gripped him since the letter's arrival. "Then we will meet them with the truth, fully and without hesitation. I have hidden from grief long enough, Eliza. I will not hide from this. We will meet them together," Eliza said firmly, "whatever comes." He reached for her hand then, his fingers closing around hers with a warmth that steadied her, despite the uncertainty ahead. "Together," he agreed. "I do not think I could face this without you beside me." Outside, the winter wind pressed against the ancient stones of Crowmoor, carrying with it the promise of a confrontation neither of them could avoid much longer. But for the first time since the rumors had begun, Eliza felt something steadier than fear settling into her chest, a quiet certainty that whatever storm Constance had set in motion, she and the Duke would weather it, as they had weathered every challenge since her arrival, together and unbroken. The formal inquiry, when it came, arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet, methodical process, that nonetheless carried the weight of everything the Duke feared. A representative from Cassandra's family, a solemn man named Mr. Sinclair, arrived at Crowmoor a week after the rumors had reached their peak, accompanied by a county magistrate whose presence alone signaled the seriousness with which the accusations were being treated. Eliza stood beside the Duke as they received their visitors in the drawing room, her hand resting lightly at his elbow, a small gesture of solidarity that she hoped conveyed more confidence than she entirely felt. Mrs. Whitmore had prepared tea, though no one touched it, the atmosphere in the room too heavy with tension for such simple courtesies. "Your Grace," Mr. Sinclair began, his tone careful and measured, "I trust you understand the gravity of what has reached my family's ears. Cassandra was dear to us, and rumors of her death being anything other than what we were told cannot go uninvestigated." "I understand entirely," the Duke said, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "And I welcome whatever investigation you deem necessary. I have nothing to hide and everything to lose by concealing truth that could easily be uncovered regardless." "Dr. Bramwell has provided a written account," Eliza added, gesturing to the folder of documents Mrs. Whitmore had prepared, detailing the Duchess's decline following the loss of her child, and confirming the illness that ultimately claimed her life. "We have also gathered statements from members of this household who witnessed her final months." Mr. Sinclair accepted the documents with careful hands, reading through them slowly, while the magistrate observed the exchange with professional detachment. The silence stretched long enough that Eliza felt her pulse quicken with each passing moment, though she forced herself to remain outwardly composed. "These are thorough," Mr. Sinclair said finally, setting the papers down. "Dr. Bramwell's account aligns entirely with what the family understood at the time of Cassandra's passing. I confess, Your Grace, that the rumors reaching us seemed inconsistent with the reports we received then. I am inclined to believe they originated from malice rather than genuine concern." "They did," the Duke said firmly. "Lady Constance Ashworth has borne a grudge against me for some years, since I chose to marry Cassandra rather than pursue a match with her family had hoped for. I believe she spread these rumors deliberately, to damage my reputation and, I suspect, to damage my current marriage as well." The magistrate spoke for the first time, his expression thoughtful. "Such accusations, if proven false and deliberately spread with malicious intent, could constitute a serious offense in their own right, Your Grace. Would you be willing to pursue formal action against Lady Ashworth, should the evidence support such a claim?" The Duke glanced at Eliza before answering, some silent question passing between them. Eliza gave a small nod, understanding the weight of the decision he faced. Pursuing formal action against Constance would end any possibility of reconciliation, would make the conflict between them permanent and public. But it would also, finally, put an end to the shadow of doubt Constance had cast over their marriage and the Duke's reputation. "I would prefer resolution over retribution," the Duke said finally. "If Lady Ashworth will publicly retract her claims and cease spreading further rumors, I have no wish to pursue formal charges against her. My concern has always been the truth, not punishment." Mr. Sinclair nodded slowly, seeming to weigh this response with evident respect. "That seems a fair and measured position, Your Grace. I will convey the family's satisfaction with the evidence presented today, and I believe this matter can be considered resolved, provided Lady Ashworth agrees to the terms you have outlined." The relief that flooded through the room was almost palpable, though Eliza noticed the Duke's shoulders remained tense even as the immediate danger passed. It was only after their visitors had departed, the carriage disappearing down the long drive toward the county seat, that he finally allowed himself to exhale fully, sinking into a chair near the fire with evident exhaustion. "It is resolved," he said quietly, as though testing the truth of the words. "Or nearly so, provided Constance agrees to retract her claims." "She will," Eliza said, moving to sit beside him. "She has little choice now, faced with formal evidence and the threat of legal consequence. Her malice has limits, Alistair, even if her bitterness does not." "I hope you are right," he said, though the weariness in his voice suggested the ordeal had cost him more than he wished to admit, even now that its immediate danger had passed. Word reached them 3 days later that Constance had indeed agreed to the terms, issuing a formal retraction to Cassandra's family, and ceasing, at least publicly, any further spread of the rumors that had threatened to unravel everything the Duke and Eliza had built together. Whether the retraction came from genuine remorse or simple self-preservation, Eliza could not say with certainty, but the practical result was the same regardless. The threat that had loomed over Crowmoor for weeks finally began to recede. In the days that followed, Eliza noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in the Duke's demeanor, something loosening in him that she had not seen before, as though facing the crisis together had burned away some final layer of the guardedness he had carried since her arrival. He sought her company more readily than ever, no longer confining his openness to careful evening conversations, but extending it into every corner of their daily life together. "I have been thinking," he said one evening, as they walked together through the frost-covered gardens, their breath visible in the crisp winter air, "about the nursery." Eliza glanced at him, surprised by the sudden shift in subject. "What about it?" "I have kept it locked away for 4 years," he said slowly, choosing his words with evident care, as though sealing the door might somehow seal away the grief itself. "But I have come to understand, these past months, that grief sealed away does not disappear. It simply waits, festering in the dark, until something forces the door open again, regardless of my wishes." "What are you saying?" Eliza asked gently. "I am saying that I would like to open that door," he said, meeting her eyes with a vulnerability she had rarely seen from him. "Not to erase what happened there, nor to forget Cassandra, or the child we lost, but perhaps to transform it into something new, something that honors what was lost, while making room for what might yet come." Eliza felt her breath catch, understanding the significance of what he was offering, not merely access to a locked room, but access to the deepest wound he carried, an invitation to help him heal it fully, rather than simply endure it alone. "I would be honored to help you open that door," she said quietly, "whenever you feel ready." "Perhaps," he said, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like weeks. "We might be ready sooner than either of us expected." They stood together in the frosted garden as the winter sun began to set behind the distant hills, and Eliza felt, for the first time since her arrival at Crowmoor, that whatever storms still lay ahead, she and the Duke would face them not as strangers bound by obligation, but as two people who had chosen, deliberately and fully, to build something real together, from the wreckage of what circumstance had first thrown carelessly into each other's path. The morning they finally opened the door to the old nursery arrived clear and cold, sunlight glittering off frost that clung to every surface of the garden. Eliza stood beside the Duke as a groundskeeper worked the rusted padlock free with careful effort, the chain finally falling away with a heavy clatter that seemed to echo far longer than it should have across the quiet grounds. The Duke hesitated at the threshold, his hand resting against the weathered door, and Eliza reached out to place her hand gently over his, offering silent support without pressing him to hurry. After a long moment, he drew a steadying breath and pushed the door open. Dust motes danced in the sudden shaft of sunlight that spilled into the room beyond, illuminating furniture draped in white cloth, a small crib positioned near the window, its frame carved with delicate details that spoke of the care and hope that had gone into its making. The air smelled of dust and disuse. 4 years of silence settled thick over everything within. The Duke stepped inside slowly, his hand trailing over the covered furniture, as though reacquainting himself with a memory he had deliberately buried. Eliza followed a step behind, giving him space to process whatever emotions the room stirred, though she remained close enough that he would know he was not facing it alone. "Cassandra chose everything herself," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "The color of the walls, the pattern of the curtains. She wanted morning light to be the first thing our child ever saw." He pulled the cloth from a small rocking chair positioned near the crib, revealing pale blue upholstery, faded slightly but otherwise untouched by time. "She used to sit here in the evenings, before either of us knew whether we would need a nursery at all, imagining what our life might look like once the child arrived." Eliza moved to stand beside him, resting a hand gently on his shoulder. "It is a beautiful room," she said softly. "She had wonderful taste." "She did," he agreed, a sad smile touching his lips. "In more than just decoration." They spent the better part of the morning in the nursery together, the Duke sharing memories he had clearly kept locked away as tightly as the room itself, stories of Cassandra's laughter, her hopes for the future, The brief joy of learning she was carrying a child, before that joy had been so cruelly taken from them both. Eliza listened without interruption, understanding instinctively that this was not a conversation to be rushed, but one that needed room to unfold at its own pace. "I do not think I ever properly grieved," the Duke admitted finally, sitting heavily in the small rocking chair, looking somehow smaller and more vulnerable than Eliza had ever seen him. "I locked this room away, and I locked my grief away alongside it, believing that if I never looked at either directly, the pain might eventually simply fade on its own." "Grief does not work that way," Eliza said gently, kneeling beside him. "It waits, patiently, until we are finally ready to face it fully." "You have taught me that," he said, reaching for her hand. "More than I think you realize. Since your arrival, I have found myself capable of feelings I believed I had buried permanently, alongside Cassandra and our child. Hope, warmth, something that feels, more and more each day, remarkably like happiness." Eliza felt her heart swell at his words, though she remained quiet, sensing he had more to say, and wishing to give him the space to say it fully. "I did not expect to find any of that again," he continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "When your father's letter arrived, I agreed to the marriage out of practicality, nothing more. I told myself I needed an heir, needed the alliance, needed to fulfill the obligations of my title, regardless of my own wishes on the matter. I did not expect to find someone who would help me heal wounds I believed permanent." "And now?" Eliza asked softly, scarcely daring to breathe as she waited for his answer. "Now," he said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath entirely. "I find myself grateful, more than I can properly express, that your father was so persistent in arranging this match. I find myself grateful for the storm that brought you to my door, and I find myself, Eliza, falling in love with a woman I once believed I was simply obligated to marry." The words settled between them, warm and certain, and Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and welcome in equal measure. "I did not expect to fall in love either," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the confession. "I came here prepared for a cold arrangement, a marriage of convenience and nothing more. I did not expect to find a man capable of such depth of feeling beneath the guarded exterior he presented to the world." "And have you?" he asked, rising from the rocking chair to stand before her, his hand still holding hers. "Fallen in love, I mean." "Completely," she said, and the word carried more certainty than she had expected it to hold. "Somewhere between the storm that brought me here and this moment, standing in a room built for hope that was so cruelly delayed, I fell in love with you, Alistair Vane, Duke of Crowmoor." He drew her closer, his free hand rising to gently cup her cheek, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the sunlit nursery, the weight of grief finally beginning to lift, replaced by something lighter, something that felt, for the first time in 4 long years, remarkably like the beginning of genuine happiness, rather than mere obligation endured. "I would like," he said finally, his voice soft but steady, "to keep this room as it is, in memory of what we lost. But I would also like, someday, if you are willing, to fill this house with new laughter, new hope, built not from obligation, but from the love we have found together, despite everything that first brought us to this point." "I would like that very much," Eliza whispered, and when he leaned down to press a gentle, lingering kiss to her forehead, she felt, for the first time since arriving at Crowmoor, in the midst of that first terrible storm, that she had finally, truly, come home. They left the nursery together. As afternoon light began to soften into evening gold, the door left open, rather than locked. A symbol, Eliza thought, of everything that had changed since her arrival. Grief no longer needed to be hidden away in darkness. It could exist alongside hope, acknowledged and honored, rather than buried and denied. As they walked back toward the main house, hand in hand, the Duke paused and turned to face her fully. "Eliza," he said quietly, "I know our marriage began under circumstances neither of us chose freely. But I find myself wishing, more than I can properly express, that we might begin again, this time as 2 people choosing each other freely, rather than 2 strangers bound merely by obligation." "Then let us begin again," Eliza said, smiling up at him with a warmth that had grown steadily since that first cold night in his study. "Here, in this garden, with the whole of Crowmoor as our witness." He smiled then, fully and without reservation, an expression so transformed from the guarded stranger she had first met that Eliza scarcely recognized him, though she recognized, with absolute certainty, the man he had become since that stormy arrival months before. "Then I choose you, Eliza Hartwell," he said softly, "not out of obligation, not because your father insisted I needed a wife, but because I have come to know you, truly, and I find that I want nothing more than to spend the remainder of my life earning the love you have so generously offered me." "And I choose you," Eliza replied, her heart full to overflowing. "Alistair Vane, not the Duke bound by duty, but the man I have come to love beneath that title." The winter sun set behind the hills of Crowmoor, as they walked back together toward the castle, that had once felt so cold and forbidding, now warmed by something far more enduring than any fire could provide. Whatever storms had brought them together, whatever grief and doubt had tested the bond between them, they had emerged not merely intact, but stronger, bound now not by paper and obligation, but by a love neither had expected to find, yet both had come, gradually and completely, to cherish above all else. Spring came to Crowmoor with a gentleness the castle had not known in years. The neglected gardens Eliza had once found overgrown and abandoned, now blooming steadily under her careful attention. Roses climbing fresh trellises, hedges trimmed into shapes that spoke of a household finally tending to its own beauty, rather than simply enduring within crumbling walls. The transformation was not limited to the grounds alone. The castle itself seemed to breathe differently, warmer somehow, though Eliza knew the change had little to do with the changing season, and everything to do with the healing that had taken place within its ancient stones. The old nursery, left open since that afternoon months before, had slowly transformed as well. The Duke had commissioned new furnishings, keeping certain pieces from before as quiet tributes to what had come first, while adding new elements that spoke of hope rather than sorrow alone. Fresh curtains caught the morning light exactly as Cassandra had once envisioned, though now they framed a room filled with genuine anticipation rather than grief alone. Lady Margaret visited more frequently now, her relationship with her brother mended fully, warm laughter often filling the halls of Crowmoor during her stays, in a way the household had not heard in years. Even Mrs. Whitmore, once so careful and guarded in her manner, had softened considerably, her stern exterior giving way, on occasion, to genuine smiles, as she watched the household she had served so faithfully, finally return to something resembling joy. Nan, too, had grown less nervous in her duties, no longer flinching at questions about the household's past, understanding instinctively that whatever shadows had once haunted Crowmoor had been faced directly and, gradually, laid to rest. She spoke often now of the changes she had witnessed since Eliza's arrival, marveling quietly to the other servants at how thoroughly the castle had transformed under the new Duchess's care. Of Constance Ashworth, little was heard following her formal retraction. Word occasionally reached Crowmoor of her whereabouts, rumors of a hasty marriage to a distant landowner in another county, though the Duke and Eliza gave such news little attention, content to leave that particular chapter of their history firmly behind them. Whatever bitterness Constance carried, it no longer had power to touch the peace they had built together. On a bright morning in early spring, Eliza stood once more at the window of what had once been the cold, unfamiliar blue chamber she had first occupied upon her arrival, though the room itself had changed considerably since then, warmer furnishings replacing the sparse arrangements of that first stormy night, personal touches scattered throughout that spoke of a home rather than a mere guest chamber awaiting a stranger's brief occupation. The Duke found her there, as he often did in quiet mornings, drawing her gently into his arms, as they both looked out over the gardens below, roses beginning their first bloom of the season, the small stone building at the edge of the grounds, no longer chained and forbidding, its door standing open to the morning light, exactly as it had remained since that transformative afternoon months before. "Do you remember," he said softly, his chin resting lightly against the top of her head, "the first words you spoke to me, that stormy night you arrived?" Eliza smiled, turning slightly within his embrace to meet his eyes. "My father said you needed a wife," she recited, the words that had once felt so uncertain, now carrying only warmth and fond memory. "And I told you he was right," the Duke continued, his own smile widening as he recalled the exchange. Though I confess, I had no true understanding then of just how right he truly was. Nor did I, Eliza admitted. I expected a cold arrangement, a marriage built on nothing more than obligation and necessity. I never imagined I would find genuine happiness within these walls, nor a man capable of such depth of feeling beneath the guarded exterior he first presented. You transformed everything, the Duke said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. This house, this family, and certainly the man you found grieving alone within these walls. I do not know that I can ever adequately express my gratitude, Eliza, for choosing to stay, for choosing to fight for something real, rather than simply enduring the arrangement circumstance first placed upon us. You gave me reason to stay, Eliza said softly. Every honest word, every small kindness, every door you chose to open, rather than keep locked away. I did not transform Crowmoor alone, Alistair. We transformed it together. He drew her closer, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, exactly as he had that first afternoon in the reopened nursery, and Eliza felt, standing there in the warm spring sunlight streaming through the window, a profound sense of gratitude for the strange, unexpected path that had led her to this moment, a father's persistence. A stranger's honest admission, a storm that had seemed, on that first terrible night, like an omen of hardship rather than the beginning of genuine happiness. Later that day, as they walked together through the blooming gardens, the Duke paused near a newly planted rose bush, its first buds just beginning to unfurl in the gentle spring warmth. I had this planted in Cassandra's memory, he said quietly, and in memory of the child we lost. But also, he continued, turning to face Eliza fully, as a symbol of new beginnings, of hope, planted where grief once grew alone. It is beautiful, Eliza said, moving closer to examine the delicate buds. A fitting tribute to everything this house has overcome. There is something else, the Duke said, a nervousness entering his voice, that Eliza had rarely heard from him since those early guarded days of their acquaintance. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped bundle, placing it gently in her hands. Eliza unwrapped it slowly, to find a delicate silver locket, engraved with a small rose pattern that matched, she realized with a soft intake of breath, the very bush before which they now stood. Inside, when she opened it carefully, she found two small portraits, exquisitely painted, one of herself and one of the Duke, positioned facing each other, as though gazing eternally into one another's eyes. I commissioned it some weeks ago, the Duke explained, watching her reaction carefully. As a token of everything we have built together, and everything I hope we might yet build in the years ahead. It is perfect, Eliza said, her voice thick with emotion, as she fastened the locket around her neck, letting it rest gently against her chest, close to her heart. Thank you, Alistair, for this, and for everything. Thank you, he replied softly, for answering my father's letter, with such grace, even when you had every reason to resent the circumstances that brought you here. Thank you for seeing past my grief to find whatever remained worth loving beneath it. And thank you, most of all, for choosing, again and again, to stay and fight for something real, rather than simply enduring what circumstance first handed us both. They stood together among the blooming roses as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward evening, the castle behind them no longer a place of locked doors and careful silences, but a home built genuinely on trust, honesty, and a love neither had expected to find, yet both had come to treasure above all else. Whatever storms life might yet bring their way, Eliza understood with quiet certainty that she and Alistair would face them together, bound not by obligation or convenience, but by a bond forged through honesty, patience, and the courage to open doors that grief had once kept firmly closed. Her father's words, spoken so long ago in a study far from Crowmoor, echoed once more in her memory, carrying now a warmth and truth she could never have anticipated. On that first stormy night of her arrival, my father said you needed a wife, she had murmured to a stranger, standing guarded and distant by his study window. And he was right, the Duke had answered, though neither of them had truly understood, in that uncertain moment, just how completely those simple words would come to define the genuine happiness they would eventually build together. One honest conversation, one open door, one act of quiet courage at a time.